You're listening to What Mad Universe on the Greenlit Podcast Network. Check out all our shows at greenlitpodcasts.com. Content warning: incest, rape, American imperialism, and war. What is it good for?
Action, excitement,
horror, romance,
thrills and chills,
swords and sorcery,
rockets and ray guns, a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe?
So far, we had never taken a brain bug alive. We had either cleaned out colonies from the surface, as on Sheol, or, as had too often been the case, raiders had gone down their holes and not come back. A lot of brave men had been lost this way. Still more had been lost through retrieval failure. Sometimes a team on the ground had its ship or ships knocked out of the sky. What happens to such a team? Possibly it dies to the last man. More probably it fights until power and ammo are gone. Then survivors are captured as easily as so many beetles on their backs. As may be, we wanted those prisoners back. In the grim logic of the universe, this may be a weakness. Perhaps some race that never bothers to rescue an individual may exploit this human trait to wipe us out. The skinnies have such a trait, only slightly, and the bugs don't seem to have it at all. Nobody ever saw a bug come to the aid of another because he was wounded. They cooperate perfectly in fighting, but units are abandoned the instant they are no longer useful. Our behavior is different. How often have you seen a headline like this? 2 die attempting rescue of drowning child. If man gets lost in the mountains, hundreds will search and often 2 or 3 searchers are killed. But by the next time somebody gets lost, just as many volunteers turn out. Poor arithmetic, but very human. It runs through all our folklore, all human religions, all our literature. A racial conviction that when one human needs rescue, others should not count the price. Weakness? It might be the unique strength that wins us a galaxy. Hi there, and welcome to a possibly controversial episode of What Mad Universe, the podcast that delves into the history of genre fiction and the origins of pop culture. Today we're looking at what is, for good or ill, one of the foundational texts of science fiction, and a major impact on pop culture, both in and of itself and via the film adaptation it spawned, Robert A. Heinlein's Starship Troopers. We're joined by prolific blogger and podcaster Andrew Hickey of the Science Justice League blog. Hello,
Hi.
Andrew.
Hi there.
Hello, good to have you. Yes, he's written illuminatingly about Heinlein, so we thought he'd be a good guest to have on the show. And of course, Phil. Hi, Phil.
Hi.
And
Or hoorah or whatever.
Poorah, yes. All this very jingoistic episode that we're going to be dealing with. So, of course, this is one of the more prominent books in the science fiction canon. And to the point where, some people absolutely love it and some people absolutely loathe it. And it was written by Robert A. Heinlein, who is generally considered one of the great grandmasters of science fiction, who did actually have a naval career, lasted from what I understand, about 5 years. And it was cut short because he had illness. I believe it was a form of tuberculosis that caused him to have to leave. In around 1934, so he never served during wartime, and so a lot of people have described this book as kind of a what's the word? A bit of a peon
Fascist?
to. Well, we'll get there, but it's a bit of peon to what might have been. It was him sort of glowingly describing the military career he might have had in science fiction form. Yeah, so Phil, you didn't like this book very much.
No. It wasn't my thing. I found the political. It's made up largely of political diatribes, of which I very much disagreed with everything.
Right.
And what story was there wasn't very interesting to me. Maybe it's a issue of it. I don't know. So much of our culture now is sort of this, so many movies and stuff are boot camp stuff. So maybe it was more interesting at the time, but I just it was a rough one for me, even though it wasn't very long.
Yeah, and you actually recommended we do this, if I'm not mistaken, right? It was your.
Oh yeah. I thought I thought it would be interesting. I'm fine with reading things I don't like to within reason.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I mean, there's no denying that this book has had a major impact, not just on science fiction, but arguably in the culture at large. You were saying the other day you saw Ben Shapiro using one of the arguments that I think originated in this book. If I'm not mistaken.
I'm not sure if it originated with this book, but I had heard an argument from Ben Shapiro fairly recently, where he tried to disprove the labor theory of value, where he said, if you make mud pies, that's useless, and you might be putting work into it, but nobody's going to buy it because it's useless. And that's supposedly a big gotcha of socialism in general. I don't know. But it seems to have, at least an early version of it was appeared pretty much word for word in this book in one of the political sections.
Yeah, it's definitely. I think Heinlein has been a big influence on conservative libertarians and conservatism as we now experience in general. But anyway, Andrew was just actually before we started recording, Andrew was telling me a bit about Heinlein's sort of writing career in general and sort of how his politics seems to have fluctuated a lot. So Andrew, can you tell us a bit more about that? You were just describing it there.
Okay, so Heinlein went through a series of different political positions over his life, while always claiming that he kept to the same positions. One thing that he was always consistent on, he was always a believer in patriotism and in America first and in the value of the military. And that's obviously something that comes across very, very strongly in Starship Troopers. And it comes across in most of his work. But everything else in his politics changes dramatically over the decades. He starts out in the 30s as... he probably wouldn't have used the word socialist, but he was in effect. He was certainly at least a social democrat. He was on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. He supported Upton Sinclair's campaigning. He was a very big believer in a system called social credit, which was put forward by Upton Sinclair, and that was basically about, as best I understand it, about the idea of credit and the monetary system being put under democratic control rather than being controlled by banks. And this was Heinlein's first big thing, his first big campaigning thing in the 30s. His first novel, which wasn't released until decades later, long after he died, For Us the Living, is basically this rather dull, turgid diatribe about social credit, which is frankly unreadable. And so then he becomes a big supporter of Roosevelt. He's very much on the left of the Democratic Party, but he's also very much about patriotism and about America first, and particularly about the military. He served in the military. He believed the military was the making of him. Then, during World War II, he marries, I think she was his third wife, she might have only been his second, but Virginia, who became his wife for the rest of his life.
Yes, it was his third wife, that's correct, yeah.
Yeah. And she was rabidly right-wing. She hated Roosevelt with a passion. She was very, very, very far right. Not, as far as I'm aware, racist or any of those things, but on the far libertarian wing. And she became a big influence on Heinlein's politics And over the decades, he emphasised his belief in the military and his belief in individual liberty more and more, and de-emphasised his beliefs in economic justice more and more and more. He left the Democrats in 1954, and he became this reactionary, right-wing, Republican hawk, gung-ho. But at the same time, he was never the dogmatic kind of Trump Republican that you see now. For example, he was very, very much about. He considered himself a feminist, although he was deeply sexist, and he put forward what he thought were feminist attitudes. But it was the sort of women should be in charge because they're better than men because they're so much nicer kind of thing.
Yes, I noticed that. The sort of it's a gender essentialist kind of feminism. Almost.
Yes.
Yeah, it comes through in this book where women are suited to be pilots. And it goes into various reasons, and one of them is that the men who drop down see a woman and remember what they're fighting for before they drop. So
yes, exactly that kind of thing. And he moved very, very much to the right-wing libertarian individualist kind of thing, without too much of the racist stuff that is the backbone of right libertarianism, unfortunately. The libertarian movement in America really comes from the opposition to desegregation and the opposition to civil rights, but they pretended otherwise. The other big influence on him in this respect was John Campbell, who was the editor of Astounding magazine, and he was a frothing, rabid racist. He published defences of slavery. He published constant support for segregation in the 50s and 60s. He was a really vile human being, but he was the editor who Heinlein was writing for, and he was somebody who Heinlein respected intellectually. And so you see Heinlein shaping his writing early on to not include too much in the way of racial equality and that kind of thing, which was something Heinlein believed in, again, to the extent of a white man with a military ethos born in the early years of the last century. You know, he wasn't progressive by our standards, but he was progressive by their standards. But again, he de-emphasised that for a long time. And that's something that he actually started to emphasise more as he went on, and as he was writing novels rather than writing short stories for Astounding.
Mm-hmm. That is really interesting because when you look at what Heinlein did, as you say, he kind of had this evolution. The very last show we did, we were talking about Star Trek, and we were talking about Gene Roddenberry, and he was also a Navy man and also literally a cop, and his politics. They're almost, in a weird way, the inverse or complementary to Heinlein's, in that he moved into this very strange economic, political, almost communist viewpoint, and it was almost entirely through what he had written and the fans responding to what he'd written, and it was through sort of chasing ideas. And Heinlein's the same, but went in the opposite direction. It was just from exposure to people and from openness to new ideas, he went down this other rabbit hole of right libertarianism, basically.
Yeah. Although both Heinlein and Roddenberry's sexual politics were more or less identical, and probably their racial politics, their economic attitudes were very, very different, but otherwise they were very similar figures in a lot of ways. But they both. Heinlein's last period actually is very Roddenberry-esque, or very the kind of thing that Roddenberry wanted to write but couldn't get away with on network TV, because as you probably know, Roddenberry was a gigantic pervert and basically wanted every episode of Next Generation to be about orgies. And most of Heinlein's work for his last couple of decades, particularly, he started to develop blood clots in his brain, and also stopped having anybody edit his work, and that meant it becomes this sort of free-form rambling, often fantastically interesting but also crazy stuff, and a lot of it turns out to be about incestuous orgies, basically.
Yes, I've read. I think it's Time Enough for Love, the one about Lazarus
Yeah.
Long, which is
Yeah.
literally just a series of sexual encounters in many ways.
Yes, yeah. And the sexual encounters with, like, his mum and clones of himself, and yeah. Yeah, and so in that way, Heinlein is a very Roddenberry-esque figure. They're very similar in that way, and as you say, in their naval backgrounds. And indeed, the social credit stuff that Heinlein supported in the 30s is quite close to the economic stuff that Roddenberry later claimed to support. So yeah, I'd not thought of that parallel before, but they are very similar figures. Yeah,
And it's interesting because you can look at the parallel, the way Heinlein's politics evolved, and in some ways and I'm not an American. None of us here are Americans, but we're commenting on American culture. But based on from everything I've seen and what I've read, you can sort of track an evolution of politics from the pre-World War II period to the post-World War II period, where what was very normalized, as you say, Upton Sinclair running for I believe it was Congress he ran for, and you see this embracing of a lot of socialist ideas, but after World War II, those kind of came out in a more right-wing form. And even again, talking about Roddenberry, you see Star Trek in its earliest form. That was almost a baseline for science fiction in many ways. It was a little more progressive. It embraced the idea of racial harmony a little more. But and you see it in Starship Troopers as well. It's this idea of, okay, there's going to be one world government. We're all going to be united as a people, all the different nations, but America's going to be running the show still, implicitly. But we're going to embrace all the different countries. Early on in Starship Troopers, he actually has the big scene, which if people have seen the movie will know, when the sergeant says, "Anyone who thinks they can lick me, come at me." And in the book, it's explicitly a pair of Germans and a Japanese guy come at him, and this was only a decade or so after World War II. So it almost felt like he was emphasizing that, we're all going to be united at this point. Let's get over, World War II era, and we're all going to be fighting. And later there's a Muslim, there's, different people.
And Johnny Rico, the main character, is Juan Rico, and he's implied to be Filipino, I believe.
Right. Yes, he is, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, the movie whitewashed them all, but it sort of worked with the movie for once, because the movie was, we'll talk about this, but obviously parodying the book in a lot of ways, and that sort of fits the Nazi propaganda aspect of the film that it was going for.
Right.
Yeah, and also dark implications that South America has been taken over by white people.
I almost feel like I'm playing devil's advocate here, because, there's aspects of the book where you can see a well-meaning attitude coming out from what Heinlein was writing. Like, as you say, I mean, he wanted to write about a pluralistic culture. He didn't want it to be, for all that I think Heinlein has influenced modern day libertarianism very heavily. I think it's telling. I've talked before about how someone like Jordan Peterson, well, maybe not on this podcast, but I've talked before, Jordan Peterson may have been influenced by Dave Sim, the comic book writer. And in the same way, it feels like a lot of people, the Ben Shapiros, the hardcore so-called libertarians, probably read a lot of Heinlein growing up. And actually,
absolutely.
Yeah, I think actually, in fact, Andrew, since you know a lot about this, maybe I think there's a link there in the whole Sad Puppies campaign from a few years ago. Maybe do you want to tell us about that, since you were following it pretty closely, I think.
Yes. Well, the thing is, Heinlein is both an understood and a misunderstood figure, often by the same people. Heinlein was attempting to write philosophical fiction. He was thinking of himself as being like George Bernard Shaw and people like that, using his fiction to put across ideas. And many of the ideas he was putting across in the 1960s were very, very right libertarian in the Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, whoever kind of way. You read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and that won retrospectively the Prometheus Award, which is an award given by libertarian science fiction, and sometimes that goes to stuff that is ideologically completely not libertarian. People like Charlie Stross have won the award. But in the case of Heinlein, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress fits perfectly into the worldview of 60s and 70s white libertarianism, and in particular their obsessions with gold buggery, their obsessions with segregation being a states' rights issue, these kind of things, which are very. I mean, you replace the gold standard with Bitcoin, and you've got modern day libertarians still. It's the same thing. A huge amount of American libertarianism seems to be based either on just pure racism or on wanting Thomas Jefferson to have won the intellectual war with Alexander Hamilton when Hamilton won when it comes to fractional reserve banking and things. And The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is basically a take on the American Revolution but in space, and it comes down on the Jeffersonian side quite hard. It's where you get the phrase, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, which is obviously a very libertarian slogan. But the sad puppies are the kind of right-wingers who call themselves libertarian but are actually fascist. I can guarantee you that everybody involved in the Sad Puppy campaign voted for Trump. Now, the Sad Puppies was a thing that happened for about 3 or 4 years in the middle of the last decade. Basically, a writer called Larry Correia, who wrote dumb adventure fiction, but with tons of pro-gun propaganda in it. The kind of thing where people would go out and shoot a load of monsters, then stop and talk for 10 minutes about how dreadful it would be if the government took their guns away so they couldn't shoot the monsters, then go back to shooting more monsters. I'm not even exaggerating. That's the books. He was nominated for the Campbell Award, named after John W. Campbell, who I mentioned earlier, the editor of Astounding, which is an award for new writers. It's actually recently had its name changed because people said, hang on, we shouldn't be giving this award named after the biggest racist in the whole of science fiction history, even including H.P. Lovecraft.
Jeez.
Yeah. But Larry Correia was nominated for this award in, I think it was 2013, and he didn't win. And he decided this was because the Campbell Award is the award for new writers that is given by the same people who vote on the Hugo Awards. And he decided this is because everybody who votes on the Hugo Awards are a bunch of snobs, and they don't like proper adventure fiction that people actually like to read, the common man, So he got tons of his fans to sign up and nominate him and then vote for him as a vote for proper, real, manly adventure pulp fiction, not any of this highbrow intellectual nonsense. Well, of course, the Hugo Awards never go to highbrow intellectual nonsense. At best, they're middlebrow, Right. But their simultaneous things are that the Hugo Awards are biased towards liberals and against conservatives, and that the Hugo Awards don't like gung-ho action adventure with no morals, just a good plain story. Although, as I say, what they consider political ideology, if your book has a gay character, that makes it political. But if your book has somebody stop and talk for 20 minutes about how the Second Amendment is the greatest thing in the world, that's not political. That's just good storytelling, is their view.
Right. Yeah.
We see this sort of attitude reflected in a lot of other, the various gates and stuff where keep politics out of my comic books, but the stuff they produce is always explicitly political.
I sort of read the Sad Puppies as sort of the bridge between Gamergate and Comicsgate and that's the science fiction community. It didn't get as much play, I think, in the general knowledge, and it seems to have died down, although maybe I'm wrong, but I don't seem to see the Sad Puppies playing as much of a role as they did before. Maybe I'm just not paying as much attention anymore.
Right. The Sad Puppies, like I say, the Hugos changed the rules, so the Sad Puppies techniques to get on the ballot don't work anymore. They've made it so that things that are on an organised slate where everybody's voting in lockstep don't get weighted as highly, and so their techniques don't work. Now, the where this connects to Heinlein is, firstly, obviously, these people call themselves libertarian, although they are the kind of, quote, libertarian, unquote, that is Trumpist and that is fascist. They also said that Heinlein was the model of the kind of stories that they wanted to write. Thinking of things like Starship Troopers, not the bulk of his material, but that specific sort of window. And they said that people don't want good old adventure stories by people like Heinlein right now. But I'm going to read out a quote from Heinlein. This is from a letter he wrote about the kind of criticism he doesn't like. And you'll see if Heinlein really would have fit in with the puppies or not. He will permit any speculation at all, as long as it is about gadgets only and doesn't touch people. He doesn't care what mayhem you commit on physics, astronomy, or chemistry with your gadget, but the people must be the same plain old wonderful jerks that live in his hometown. Give him a good old adventure story any time, with lots of gee whiz in it, and spaceships blasting off, and maybe the good guys in white spaceships chasing the bad guys in black spaceships. But brother, don't you say anything about the Methodist Church, or the flag, or incest, or homosexuality, or teleology, or theology, or the sacredness of marriage, or anything philosophical. Because you're just an entertainer, see? That sort of heavy thinking is reserved for C.P. Snow or Graham Greene. You are a pulp fighter, bud, and you will always be a pulp fighter, even though your trivia is now bound in boards and sells for just as much as Grace Metalius' stories. And you are not permitted to have heavy thoughts. Spaceships and heavy thinking do not mix, so shut up and sit down. The rule is, science fiction by its nature must be trivial. This, of course, rules out a large fraction of my work and all my future work, I think.
Yeah.
Now, that pretty much sums up exactly what the puppies' rhetoric was, and what they said, almost word for word. And he was, that's everything he despised. Which is why, despite his politics being abysmal for much of the time, despite his weird obsessions, Heinlein is a fundamentally more honest, more interesting, more readable artist than any of these people who considered themselves to be following in his footsteps.
Well said. And on that note, let's pause for a word from our sponsors.
Video Deathloop is a podcast where we watch a short video clip on loop until we just can't take it anymore. Along the way, we'll try our best to make each other laugh and to hold out longer than the other guy. You can jump in on any episode, no need to worry about continuity. Check out Video Deathloop on the Greenlit Podcast Network with new episodes every Friday.
Hey Chris, what's the War Rocket Ajax podcast about?
Well, Matt, if we were smart, it'd be about murders, but it's actually about comics.
War Rocket Ajax. It's not about murders, but it is weekly on the Greenlit Podcast Network.
Yeah, actually, that brings up an interesting point that in many ways, from what I've read of Heinlein, I've read some of his stuff, Starship Troopers is not really characteristic of his work, despite being, one of the granddaddies of his work. And the other two things I guess there's also, as you say, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which, as you say, it's the American it's the libertarian wet dream of the American Revolution in space. So those seem to be the two seminal texts for these people. But he also wrote Stranger in a Strange Land, which is one of the seminal sort of hippie texts that's out there.
Yes.
And his later stuff seems to have been, again, sort of peons to sex and philosophy, I guess, as you said. So it's really fascinating that those are the two that everyone fixates on with Heinlein. As much as it's the premise, I'm sure everyone knows the premise at this point, but the core aspect of Starship Troopers is just the idea of a future where you have to serve in the military in order to be franchised as a voter. You have to serve.
Not quite. You have to perform some kind of public service to be franchised as a voter.
Right.
It doesn't have to be military service. And this is something that Heinlein always emphasised when he was talking about the novel, far more than he emphasised in the novel itself. I think partly he was trying to soften the implications of the novel, but also, it's mentioned briefly in the novel that you can do other things. But yeah, for practical purposes in the novel, it seems to be the novel is about military service, but you could technically be doing other stuff. He just doesn't care about the other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's sort of weird because how it describes the society getting set up is that local military people took over areas that were, rife with crime and stuff, and they only trusted other veterans to serve in public office and stuff. So it just sort of grew out of that naturally. which doesn't really fit with the, you can be a other kind of public servant.
I think that's the case about this novel, and with a lot of stuff that, people of this nature write, where they really are interested in exploring the ideas. Like, I think Heinlein, whatever you want to say about him, he's clearly got a good faith interest in exploring all these ideas, and I think that was characteristic of these post-World War II sci-fi writers, of which Heinlein is one of the granddaddies. They really, really did want to explore these ideas. They really, really did want to have a discussion. They probably would have had a discussion. I'm not saying they wouldn't have punched you in the face if you said the wrong thing, but they would have wanted to hear these converse ideas and had a big discussion about it and had a whole conversation. They weren't like the people we're talking about, who are just using it as an excuse to push their views. When they say we don't want politics, what they mean is we want our politics and we don't want anyone to question it. Heinlein probably would have been good with people questioning it and exploring new ideas and pushing it. So there is a genuine feeling of good faith, I think, coming from his work and even this book itself. But then you do have to look at the basic core of what he's writing, and it's not bizarre that people read this book as fascist and jingoistic, because it really does emphasize the military aspect of things. As Phil says, the society is literally evolving out of veterans who took the place of, and he talks about how democracy failed. There's actually a big, as Phil was mentioning, there's a huge rant about corporal punishment, and specifically he seemed to have the 50s fixation on juvenile delinquency. There's a whole passage.
And how spanking children would cause this to go away, as if, the reason that crime happens is we don't beat up children enough.
That, almost more than anything else, dates it, because you can see it was written during that period when everyone thought juvenile delinquency was going to lead to the collapse of society, and that was the big thing that we had to be concerned about, and not,
But it's the 50s we have to go back to, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes, this is what I'm... as always, it's the idealization of the 50s rather than the actual 50s as they were. It really is. So when your emphasis is that, and as you say, the emphasis, he does say, you're right, in the book, it's very clearly said, as long as you do public service of one kind or another, you're considered valid for voting. But he really emphasizes the military as sort of and it's implicitly, if not explicitly stated, that is the highest form of public service you can do. Is military. And I mean, he has a point, of course. He literally says, well, you're laying your life on the line to protect the civilization of which you're a part. In some ways, there's things that even a leftist couldn't disagree with, and saying that, it's got to be about a communal effort and we've got to work together. That passage I cited at the beginning is not the passage of a modern-day right-wing or a modern-day conservative. It's someone who legitimately believes that we all have to work together. It's just that he sees it as being under the umbrella of the military, as it were, being the primary focus. Now he talks about... we've all got to work together and function as part of the military, but at the same, and you can see him. You can also see him struggling with communism throughout the book. We mentioned this earlier, because he can understand that communal working, and as you said, he worked for Upton Sinclair. People who don't know, Upton Sinclair was a socialist, as well as he was a writer. He wrote the Jungle, and but he ran for politics a few times as a socialist, and then as a Democrat, but a Bernie Sanders kind of Democrat, very socialist. And Heinlein worked for him for his campaign, and then stood himself as a Democrat in the 30s as well. So you can see him getting on board. As I say, you can see the evolution of this attitude of, we've all got to work together. We've all got to be part of the collective society. We've got to do what's best for society, and put ourselves, put our neighbors, above ourselves, or at least on par with ourselves. And you can see how that evolved in the 50s into but communism.
Yes.
Communism. It's not great. To the point where even the bugs in this novel are he more or less explicitly says they're communists of a kind.
Yes.
Right?
He says they're that humans can't really do communism, but because of how we're made up, but the bugs can. So they have a true communism because of their genetic makeup.
Right. And again, but you would read the book and you'd think it would be a very right-wing screed, and then you read some of his other stuff, and it doesn't seem to compute. To the point, actually, when I first read the book, I had seen the movie, and I read the book, and I thought, oh, gee, this book, maybe the book is meant ironically, too. I wasn't 100% sure. That was my influence from the movie, of course. I was kind of going, oh, because he does, there are implications in the book, arguably, that he doesn't 100% think it's an idealized society. Maybe.
Yeah.
He does, he talks about juvenile delinquency, and then there's a scene where Johnny and his friends get jumped by juvenile delinquents who are running rampant in the scene. So you kind of have to wonder if he did mean for it to be a bit, and Rico is explicitly meant to be a meathead who doesn't really understand everything and only gets a glimpse of the society of which he is a part. So that is another window into, and plus you see the movie, and every military action they do in the movie is just a complete failure. Like they keep messing up over and over again. And you would think that would be Verhoeven, but that is in the book too. They keep messing up militarily. They're losing the war for much of the book, and it's not resolved at the end of the book any more than the movie. So you kind of there is the window into looking at the book and saying maybe we shouldn't take everything he's saying as literal as he can. But what do you think, Andrew? Am I completely insane on that point?
No, you're not at all. Heinlein saw his writing as a way of exploring ideas rather than a way of showing finished ideas. It wasn't putting down his conclusions. He was working out his ideas about what he thought about things as he was writing, and so there is often not a dogmatism there. There's often, which is weird because he was a very dogmatic. His writing style is very dogmatic. He will have people just say, laying down the law. This is this, and that's the way it is, and that's the end of it. But then you'll read another book, and he'll say completely the opposite thing in the exact same style. So this sort of very hard-edged, macho, masculine, I am 100% right and will brook no opposition style sort of doesn't. Makes him read as being more dogmatic about the ideas in the books than he was. And certainly he would say later that he thought there were both good and bad points about the society in Starship Troopers, and that it wasn't meant to be an idealized perfect society. Although I believe, I can't remember for sure, it's a while since I read it, but I believe he said that he thought it was probably slightly superior in many ways to the society he was living in. But for example, He would often write a book to see what he thought about something. He wouldn't be writing a book to tell you what he thought about something. And so yes, you get these weird incongruities in there. And yes, he didn't think of Starship Troopers as being any kind of utopia. No.
Like he was pluralistic in that sense, in that I can have all these views coming together and maybe working together, even though they seem to be very much at odds with each other. That's how I would characterize a lot of, and not just Heinlein, but a lot of, again, the old school sci-fi people. They would tend to say, we can all have tea together and talk about these ideas.
There's a strange aspect of the book. As you mentioned, it's a world government, but very much American world government. It's obviously America won out in the ideological fight to some degree.
Right.
But they do have sort of world military history in there. There's a major bit about a French soldier during the Napoleonic Wars and stuff.
Right.
They never mention World War II and Hitler and how that sort of...
that's very interesting. I think very briefly, but yeah.
They never really bring up, like following orders at all costs. That has a very obvious historical.
Well, but at the same time, it's funny because World War II is usually the justification for American militarism. Like there in many ways there was a real lack of enthusiasm for military adventurism in the U.S. Because of coming out of World War I, and everywhere, but especially in the U.S., just the idea that, well, we shouldn't be going off and conquering other countries. And World War II
at that time,
right?
Yeah, the right wing at that time was anti entering the war, both because they often agreed with Hitler on a number of issues, but also because of that sort of nativism. America First was the name of the party.
Right. Well, and that was literally the American Bund. But it was, but yeah, there were people who maybe didn't like the Nazis, but said, yeah, but we can't get involved. We got to stay home. Whereas after World War II, with America dominating the world, the default right wing viewpoint was, well, it's our responsibility. It was the neoliberal viewpoint, right? We've got to get out there and spread our American values. Which again, it's funny because Star Trek, the original series, and Starship Troopers have that in common in that it's space America, basically, but in a positive way, mostly, but still, but we'll be in charge, though, because we're the right way.
There's a quote from Philip K. Dick. There's two quotes. I've only been able to find the actual wording for one of them, but there's another one I remember him saying. So I'll read out the one first. Philip K. Dick, for those who don't know, was a long-haired, at the time, druggy, very, very left-wing, hippie kind of person, and Heinlein was Heinlein, who we've been talking about. Now, here's the quote from Dick. Several years ago, when I was ill, Heinlein offered his help, anything he could do, and we had never met. He would phone me to cheer me up and see how I was doing. He wanted to buy me an electric typewriter, God bless him, one of the few true gentlemen in this world. I don't agree with any ideas he puts forth in his writing, but that is neither here nor there. One time, when I owed the IRS a lot of money and couldn't raise it, Heinlein loaned the money to me. And there's a bit more later, but it turns out that Heinlein didn't even know properly that Dick was in financial trouble. He'd sort of figured out that probably he needed some money, so he just sent him a check. It wasn't like Philip K. Dick had asked him or anything. He just decided to put a check in the post to this bloke he had never met, who he disagreed with on everything, because he thought he might be in trouble.
But on one level at least, you go, well, at least you're ideologically consistent. There's that. It's not great, but it's something.
That story you told reminded me of that fake Voltaire quote that's often thrown around. But may not agree with what you say, but I fight for your death to the death for your right to say it. He apparently never actually said that, though it did match his beliefs.
Oh, I thought it was a Jefferson quote. I always heard it.
No, the exact quote was from a
it was a biography of Voltaire. I'm just going to check the details of this, but there's actually a science fiction fan story that connects to that. Okay, I can't remember. I can't find the exact quote, the exact story. So the details might be wrong. But Heinlein and Isaac Asimov and Lynn Sprague de Camp and a few other people were all working in the same munitions factory, the same munitions development thingy. I think it was in California in the Second World War, and they would all eat together at the commissary. And every day they would go in, and Asimov would complain about the food, and eventually, I think it was Heinlein, but it might have been de Camp. But one of them said, Asimov, you are never allowed to complain about this food again. Just shut up. We can't be doing with it anymore. You're not allowed to say this at all. So the next few days, Asimov sits there quietly, just sulking, not talking because he wants to complain about the food. Then somebody else who's new comes in, sits down, starts eating, complains about the food, and Asimov immediately stands up and says, "I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." And
nice. Yep.
And from that point on, they allowed Asimov to complain about the food again.
Exactly. Yeah. There's always a level at which I don't think anyone can ever be 100% ideologically consistent on that point, as much as they might make a show about it. I think you're always going to run up against a point of, whether it's Karl Popper's, paradox of tolerance or something, or even just a sense of, because I think a lot of the right-wingers who talk about freedom of speech are being very hypocritical. They're doing it as an excuse to advance their own viewpoints, not to really invoke freedom of speech. But, at the same time.
Like a recent story, J.K. Rowling signing that
right.
Free speech thing, and then a week later suing somebody over saying something mean about her.
Yeah, exactly. And she'd probably say, well, you can sue them. That's not violating their freedom of speech. I don't know. Again, it's you always find some kind of loophole or some kind of legalistic way to say what you're doing is okay, even though you're, preventing someone's speech.
There's a weird idea in this that morality can be measured mathematically. Comes up a few times, but it's not really explained. Like in the classes, they're told to come up with a moral justification and provide mathematical proof.
Right.
Well,
yes.
that was a thing that would, in one way or another, would come up a lot in the writers that John Campbell mentored and edited, because it was an idea that John Campbell basically believed. He believed everything was mathematically measurable, and he believed that eventually you could turn moral philosophy into a science. And this is why you have both the psychohistory and Asimov's Foundation stories, where you have people mathematically modelling the whole future history of the galaxy, because you can model people's behaviour perfectly. And it's also where you get Scientology from, which L. Ron Hubbard first published the Dianetics books and the early Scientology stuff in Astounding. L. Ron Hubbard was a friend of Heinlein at that point. There's probably the apocryphal story that they had a bet to which one of them could start a religion first. But Dianetics and Scientology was again an attempt to scientifically calibrate morality and religion and all the ethics and these kind of things. And obviously Hubbard was a nut job, as indeed was Campbell. And this is another idea from that period that still exists a lot. I don't know if you're familiar with the so-called rationalist groups. The people that started out on a blog called Less Wrong, and then later on Slate Star Codex and so on. And they have links with they're basically where the neo-reactionaries come from, which is the sort of pseudo-intellectual side of the alt-right. And they are all... They started out as trying to create an artificial intelligence that would have the perfect morality and would run everything perfectly. And again, trying to come up with some sort of version of human ethics that can be put into computer code. It's unfortunately, it's the kind of thing that very much appeals to autistic people. I'm autistic myself, but this is a negative stereotype of autistic people, but it's one with a grain of truth. We like systems, and we like to be able to understand things, and we like to be able to put things into neat little boxes. And that the vast bulk of early science fiction fandom seems to have been autistic, and there's this crank magnet aspect going to ideas like this, and yet mathematically proving morality is a big thing in that time in those stories.
Yeah, I hadn't made the connection to Foundation. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I was, as you were saying that, I was like, yeah, you're right. Foundation, it's psychology rather than morality, but the same thing. It's if we could mathematically
about story structure and stuff. As I mentioned, the books sort of divided into lectures and plot. Most of the plot being his going through boot camp and then officers training and stuff, and then a bit of the actual war at the end.
Right.
I was interested because I rewatched the movie this week in preparation for this. And although the movie is explicitly satirical and making fun of aspects of it, it also kind of, I don't know, I'm not going to say fixes, but it sort of tweaks some things that sort of make it flow better, like the idea of his teacher becoming his commanding officer later.
Right.
That's in the movie, but in the book, the teacher who gets him to want to join the military in the first place just writes some letters later. Like,
right.
He doesn't really factor into the...
It's been Hollywoodized very heavily, which is actually part of the satire as well. Like the fact that they ramp up this love triangle to a ridiculous degree is actually, I mean, that's explicitly part of the of what Verhoeven is doing. He's making it sort of ludicrous, and it's essentially meant to be a propaganda film for the society that exists in the movie. And that was the kind of thing, if you watch, propaganda films, they often do that kind of thing. There's like, there's got to be a girl, and there's got to be,
somebody described the movie as Archie in space.
Yeah, it's 100% Archie in space. It absolutely. They even track on to like Jughead, Neil Patrick Harris's Jughead. It's. But one of the things I noticed now, of course, so just to mention this, a lot of the Heinlein fans and the kind of people we're talking about, although not not a perfect circle. There's some overlap, but there are quite a lot of people who are angry about the movie to this day and still keep plotting to remake it as a, quote, serious adaptation.
Including the producer of the Sonic the Hedgehog movie. Apparently that movie was in part designed to raise funds for a faithful adaptation of Starship Troopers.
Yeah.
So that's weird.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing that they'll usually talk about is that it was missing the power armor. That's like the number one thing everyone's upset about. Because it's so cool. And I mean, it's cool. It's a cool sci-fi premise. So I mean,
but since then we've had Iron Man and all those.
Sure, it would be redundant at this point. And in fact, even at the time they made the movie, James Cameron's Aliens obviously borrows a lot from Starship Troopers as well. Like the Marines are effectively right out of Starship Troopers. They don't have power armor either, but they have those giant, submachine guns and all. I don't know what else you want to call them.
The mech suit things.
Yeah, they're pretty close to being mech suit soldiers. So there's clearly a lot of, and of course it was a budget thing as well. That was part of the problem. When I was looking at the Wikipedia page for the movie, there's actually on Wikipedia, and there's even a citation. They talk about it was a different, unrelated.
I've actually heard that it might have. Like an early draft was an unrelated thing that just had similarities, and then they got the rights to Starship Troopers and mapped it onto it.
I'm sure that's true, but the thing is, the final movie is actually surprisingly faithful to the book in some ways. They can't really argue that the plot is there, the characters are there. Of course, they change things, but only in a Hollywood way of let's make it more exciting if he's saving his girlfriend at the climax. That's not a case of that's not used to undermine Heinlein's ideas. It's, the fact that Verhoeven is mocking Heinlein's ideas. Yeah. And he was actually very faithful to the ideas as presented in the book. They're just very simplified and streamlined.
Of course.
It's just made fun of and explicit. The bit where in the movie where the recruiter says, the mobilized infantry is what made me the man I am today, and it zooms down and he's got no legs. That's actually in the book. But it just emphasized differently. They set up disabled people as the or people who are amputees and stuff as the recruiters to dissuade people from joining up on a whim and that sort of thing.
Right. There's a different. It's essentially the same plot but a different attitude towards everything.
Yeah.
And you could almost see when you read that you kind of go, well, that's fair. I think one of the big problems with the book when you read it is that, for all that we're talking about Heinlein having different attitudes, everybody that Rico encounters in the story, the command structure, the society, is portrayed as being idealized. He never gets a bad commander. They talk about, they send the Klendathu operation is just as badly executed in the book as it is in the movie, but everyone Rico ever works under and meets directly is perfect. They're the perfect they're the perfect sergeant. They're the perfect commanding officer. They're the perfect administrator. They know how to deal with, and they care deeply about their men's personal attitude, and they know exactly when to, all the tiny little tricks to know who's going to cut it and who isn't, and all this kind of stuff. And when they have to drum someone out early on, they beat themselves up about it, and this is our failure, and so on and so forth. And I mean, not to disparage the military, who I'm sure does do a lot of that in real life, but
they're also jerks.
It's almost ludicrously idealized to the degree that they care about the psychology of their men and how everything being run as perfectly as possible. Whereas when you have a war, there's always the fact that Johnny doesn't get a field promotion in the book. He has to go through officers' school. I think if the war was as desperate as being portrayed, there would be people getting field promotions to higher ranks. That does happen, if I'm not mistaken.
Both Buenos Aires and San Francisco are destroyed in the book, off page, and it's just sort of treated as an aside. It's very odd.
Yeah. He has no well, his mother dies in Buenos Aires, but that was a fluke. She wasn't meant to be in Buenos Aires.
Yeah.
And there's no less personal connection to what's happening.
Also in the book, his father, who's opposed to him joining up into the military, in the book he later joins the military after Buenos Aires and becomes an officer. and says that he was only opposed to his son joining because, it just made him feel bad about his own choices.
Right. Yeah, it's a, in a way it's a nice moment. It's kind of like the tables turned, but it's also very much like, son, you were right and I was wrong. Everyone who ever disagreed with me is proven to be wrong, basically,
Yeah.
That's the thing you get in all Heinlein's books. Everybody who disagrees with the main character is always wrong, always.
Yes. Yeah. That's something that's something that always puts up a little red flag. No matter how well you're arguing, you kind of go, okay, but is the main character never allowed to be flawed? Is he never allowed to have a problem?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
and nobody's allowed to disagree with them without them being like some sort of pedophile or something.
Well,
not in this book, but like that's something that happens in a lot of these didactic things, where the people who disagree with you are bad, but also for other reasons.
Right.
It gets more so in the later books. It gets much more so in the later books. Pretty much every story can be summed up as an old writer with red hair who has the exact same views as Robert Heinlein, goes around being right about everything and having sex with lots of younger women. The end. It's just you have a self-insert character who is clearly based on Heinlein, and who says exactly all the things that Heinlein would say, and everybody else says, "Wow, you are so right and correct, and also you are the world's best writer, and also you are sexy."
There's also about gay issues. Like, you would defend gay people, but in the same breath defend incest. So like it's it comes with caveats. It's a little.
I'm not trying to portray him as super woke at the but he ended up coming from a weird angle and being surprisingly good on some things. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. As I was reading Starship Troopers, with the racial diversity and at least theoretical gender equality and stuff, I was thinking of it as this like woke fascism.
Yes.
Like weird sort of fascism, but with like hire more women fascists sort of thing.
Yes. Yes, it was an honor and a pleasure to have you, Andrew, on the show. That was wonderful.
Fun to be on. Yeah. I just for final thoughts. I'd just say that if people are interested, not so much in the writing particularly, but in the whole ethos around Heinlein. There have been a number of good books written about Heinlein very, very recently, over the last few years. One I would recommend, actually, though, is about John Campbell, who was the editor I mentioned, who mentored a lot of these things. It's a book called Astounding: John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction, by Alec Navarro-Lee. Read that book if you have any interest in where a lot of the ideas that have shaped the last half of the 20th century and the first couple of decades of the 21st actually come from. They come from this small handful of weird perverts mostly in New York, who all knew each other and who are all really strange. People like Alistair Crowley become a minor character in this.
He ties into the whole L. Ron Hubbard thing, because Hubbard got a lot of his ideas from Jack Parsons, who was
Well, they're blowing taps. Time to fall back to our retrieval ships and evacuate. We are Sky Marshal Adam Prosser and Fleet Admiral Philip Rice, and our guest, Staff Sergeant First Class Andrew Hickey, retired. If you haven't had a chance to do so yet, you absolutely have to check out Andrew's podcast, The History of Rock Music in 500 Songs, at 500songs.com. which is absolutely one of the best podcasts available on any subject. It's all killer, no filler. Thanks as always to our engineer and producer Alex Ross, who keeps the Roger Young flying, and the solemn and martial sounds of Jack Feerick, who wrote our theme song. Don't forget, you can listen to the show a week early by subscribing to our Patreons. Just search for Adam Prosser or Philip Rice at Patreon, or check the links on the website at neversleepsnetwork.com/series/what-mad-universe. We're also on social media, including Facebook, Tumblr, and YouTube on Philip's channel, and on Twitter at WMU Podcast. Philip is SpearHaffok_. I'm Prankster36. And Andrew is Hickey Writer, Hickey Writer, on Twitter. Also, we're on the Greenlit Podcast Network now at greenlitpodcast.com. So check out all the other great shows there. Until next time, dismissed!